the chat room. Nice to have your company. 29 minutes of conversation. I think it's 29. Doing most of the chatting is the Dean of Sydney, Phillip Jensen.
It's expanded. I thought it was 28 last week.
Whenever the person over there that they can't see tells me to stop, we'll stop.
Okay.
Okay. Now, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, Shakespeare said. But I don't know whether he's right or not. I mean, if we called them pumpkin plants, they might not have the romantic associations they currently have. But names are important things. They map out bits of territory, don't they?
They are. They're very important because they express the title deeds that you inherit. They express who you are as a group of people and where you fit into the world. So, I mean, the name Phillip doesn't do much for me, but the name Jensen does because that's my father's name.
Right.
And I
It's
have
a
a very
tribal,
high. It's
yes.
a tribal name. I have a very great love and affection for him and for my memory of him. I inherit from him my good looks, amongst everything else, but also, you know, when he died, some portion of his estate. And I also have a whole network of cousins and uncles and aunts, etc., that have all got this Jensen name.
But beyond
And
Jensen,
good looks.
Yes, and modesty.
And modesty.
There are movements, and those movements have got names, and the more people value them, the more people want to claim the name. So there's some people it's really important to say, I'm a political conservative or a democratic social democrat or something.
Yes, there's a real loyalty to it. And it's you know, kind of football clubs. You know, I married a girl who grew up in St George area during the period in time when St George run rugby league 11 seasons in a row.
Right.
And she believes that the cup actually belongs to St George. That's
And everyone else just has a lend of it occasionally.
They've got a lend of it. In fact, they haven't won for years as an irrelevance. That's still the case. And there is a brand loyalty. There is a passion. Well, she hasn't lived in St George for 40 years, but it makes no difference.
And if it's a valuable label, lots of people want to claim it, won't they?
And at the moment, as an Eastern Suburbs supporter, nobody wants to claim it. Nobody goes to their games anymore. We don't.
But in America, when Obama wins the presidency, more people want to say I'm a Democrat, don't they?
Yes, that's right.
It becomes more valuable.
It becomes a more valuable thing. Whereas if you're a loser, a McCain...
Yes. Oh, no, not the Republicans, no.
Yeah, no, I wasn't there at the time.
And if it's a really old name, like Christian, which is 2,000 years old, it starts to get a bit diffuse and diverse and a bit vague, doesn't it?
Well, like a family. Excuse me saying so about a family, but you know, you keep up with your brothers and sisters and your nephews and nieces and your first cousins, but your second cousins and your third cousins, it gets more and more confusing, and unless you actually keep a tab, you can't see the connections at all anymore.
My wife has 100 first cousins.
Yes.
And there are cousins out there we never met.
No, I can imagine that. It'd be some party if they all did turn up. Make sure it's not at your place.
I'm sorry, they'd have to bring their ID. They'd have to prove they belong to the club.
Well, I went to a family reunion recently and was introduced to some people that I had never met before in my life, who are cousins. And, so the further down the track, the number of generations, well, they're more diffuse and they're more diverse. And Christianity is a classic, a couple of thousand years. Well, there's all kinds of Christians around the world.
Yes. Well, people just want to be good, and they say, oh, well, a very Christian thing to do, meaning vague goodness of some sort.
Yes. In fact, at one stage, you could be sued for defamation if you said someone was not a Christian.
Oh, really?
Even if they were Jewish. Because by saying they're not a Christian, you were saying they're not moral.
And they're not a good person.
They're not a good person.
Yeah.
And so that's a different meaning of the word Christian than the Jew when he says, I'm not a Christian.
Yes. Let's nail it down a bit further, because some of these labels, some of these names as we're calling them, have got a positive and a negative connotation. So there are good names, and you want that badge, and bad names, and you don't want that badge.
Yes, and that moves around in different contexts too.
Right.
So I remember when I first went to university, everyone wanted to be science. And so, you know, you do economics 1, and economics is a science. You do psychology is a science.
And so the historians want to call history science.
I had a lecture on history, why history is a science, and the science of history, because you have to be a science at a university. And it's a big sellout. You know, and I sat there scratching. I was only a young fellow, but even I could work out there was something sick about the history department.
They were just grabbing the badge because it was a good badge and saying, we want to stick this on us.
Yes, we have to have this on us, otherwise we're not rational, we're not saying we're superstitious or something. So science is a magic word.
And it's not just art, it's not vague and wishy-washy.
No.
The
You can have the science of art, I'm sure.
They'll work it out one day. The opposite, because I work as a journalist, I don't have a proper job. And amongst journalists, fundamentalist is the big sneer word.
Oh, it's a wonderful word, isn't it?
Fundamentalists, you've written them off.
You have, yes. And that's what I've got a friend who calls himself a fundamentalist.
Right.
One. He does it so as to kind of debate people, so as to get people into debate, because they've never met anyone who's willing to acknowledge they're a fundamentalist. A fundamentalist is always someone who is more extreme than me.
That's right. So even Richard Dawkins can be attacked as a Darwinian fundamentalist.
Yes, he's a fundamentalist atheist.
It means the mind is closed, the shutters are in place.
Yes, that's right. But it's completely unfair to what the word meant in the first place.
Right.
So I always laugh because B.B. Warfield was one of the fundamentalists who wrote the fundamentals.
Right.
He, reading Darwin, decided that Darwin was right and evolution was right. And so he was an evolutionist,
but he was
who wrote the fundamentals.
Yes. A series of booklets that the word comes from.
Yes, because they were worried about the shift in theology in North America, and so they wrote a series of books about the fundamentals.
But that's one of the things, we can't nail a word down and say that's what it meant originally, so it always means that. They drift over time,
They drift over. You can nail it down to say that's what it meant originally. That's a worthwhile exercise to do.
But now in our language, so Calvinist meant something.
You would have thought it had something to do with Calvin.
Yes.
As a chance, as a likelihood.
As a guess, yes.
Yeah, as a guess. But yes, it's shifted. It has shifted considerably. And then there are gatekeepers that people will say, well, Calvinism is what the Synod of Dort said Calvinism is.
Yes.
It's been pointed out that Calvin actually couldn't fit in the Synod of Dort's prerequisites, but that doesn't matter. That's true Calvinism. And likewise, people lose other historical perspectives. So the word reformed was a word that distinguished the Calvinist Protestant from the Lutheran Protestant.
Right.
But that's been lost. So most people in Reformed, they still will associate it with Calvinism, but it's more, do you believe in predestination?
Right.
Which Luther did.
Yes.
At that point, Luther was Reformed.
Yes. Almost a Calvinist.
Almost a Calvinist.
Yes.
Well, he was pretty close.
So it does get to be a bit confusing, and it can matter a lot, because if people come along wearing a badge saying, trust me, I belong to the right club, how do we work out whether we trust them or not? We will get to that in a moment. But the Bible uses names and labels as sort of title deeds for territory.
Yes. Pharisees, Sadducees.
Descendants of Abraham.
Yes. Oh, yes. The offspring of Abraham is one of the most important things to be. In fact,
so
ultimately, the most important person is the offspring of Abraham.
Who's entitled to that label?
Yes. The Pharisees wanted to claim they were. The Sadducees wanted to claim they were. And John the Baptist said, God can raise up from the stones from the desert to be the children of Abraham.
And Paul said, if you've got faith, you're a child of Abraham.
Yes. And it's not a matter of keeping the law. It's a matter of having faith in, like the faith of Abraham.
But this is a good example because this is seen as a good label, so people want to claim it. So how do we work out who's really entitled to claim it? You see, there's got to be truth somewhere, not just all these different claims.
Well, the Alice in Wonderland, it wasn't the Alice in Wonderland, it was the other book, wasn't it?
No, it was Through the Looking Glass. It was Humpty Dumpty.
Humpty Dumpty,
yes.
Where you can make a word mean anything you want it to mean.
Yes, a word is whatever I say it is.
Yes, that's fair. So if you want to say Reformed means Arminian, then that's your business. You're entitled to do it. And so you can't. It's one of the beauties of English is that you can't control the language. The language does evolve and change, doesn't it? I mean, and it keeps absorbing more and more influences in it. It is dynamic and living language.
It's a living language, so it changes all the time. So
the French try and control theirs.
With their academy. It doesn't work, actually.
It doesn't work.
No. Yes.
Now, you can't, therefore, control the names.
So we have to just live with the fact that lots of people will make claims to various bits of territory, saying, I belong to this club.
That's right.
Somehow we need to see through that. How do we find out?
Part of it is to see the reality that lay behind the original title deeds.
Right.
So you want to find about whether you're a child of Abraham.
Yes.
Well, who was the real Abraham? And what did the real Abraham do?
Right.
Now, you may still say, well, today the phrase means something different to then. But at least you're saying it is different to then.
Right.
And why is it important to be the child of Abraham? It generally is because of what happened then with the Abraham, not subsequently. So who is the true Christian? Well, it's what did Jesus do? It's not what would Jesus do, it's what did Jesus do.
So it's not the WWJD little bracelet that the kids wear in America.
It's WDJD, isn't it?
What did Jesus actually do? Yes.
So that you can know the reality. Now, you may want to say, well, look, that's what Jesus did. I want to define Christianity as something different. Oh, that's perfectly all right. You're entitled to, you know.
But you should know you're doing that.
But you know you're doing that.
Yes.
And then your claim to the title deed becomes less significant, less important, because you're saying the actual title, originally, the deeds,
yes,
they don't matter.
It covered this territory. Well, I'm over here now, but I'm still going to use the name.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so if you're going to claim to be a Calvinist, you really should know what Calvin taught. You should read Calvin, and so that you are claiming to be what the man actually did believe and teach, rather than there are some things he taught that I agree with, and the Reformed group's a good group to hang with.
Yes.
So I'm going to call myself a Calvinist.
Or most of the people I tend to approve of use that label, so I'll use it too, even though I partly disagree.
Yes. I love.
It's the group I want to hang out with.
There's a couple that I've groups like this. One is the Alpha course, where there's almost everybody that I meet up with is actually in the Alpha but course. You know, we use Alpha, but we don't use that section.
Yes, yes.
Right, which the Alpha people quite rightly are upset with, because their course is their course.
Right.
But there's all these Alpha but people around, and likewise the New Perspective. You know, there's most
Tom
people,
Wright's theory on Paul.
on Paul, that you actually can see Paul from a different perspective. Now, most people who love the Bible and teach the Bible have seen through it and see that it's a great error. But there's all kinds of people who therefore won't want to say their new perspective, but 95% of what they believe is
Actually
the new perspective.
Right.
And so they say,
So
no, I'm not a new perspective person. But then when you hear them teaching, they teach the new perspective.
So, I mean, that's a case of wanting to deny a label.
Yes.
So there are people who slip from being really committed Reformed evangelicals towards a kind of liberal position. But if you said, well, you're actually a liberal.
Well, no, I'm not that. The liberal is, in certain circles, death.
Right.
In other circles, evangelical is death. And so it depends which, what would you call it, linguistic grouping you're in.
Or whose approval you want, or
And
something
whose
like
approval you want as to which word you would or wouldn't use.
Now, the danger with that is we can read a book or hear a speaker and they're wearing all the right labels.
Yes.
And if we're not thinking, if we're not critical, we'll say, oh, they've got to be okay.
Yes, that is the great danger, especially outside our own direct linguistic community.
Yes.
And that, of course, now in the cyberspace in the world that's so narrow, you listen as an Australian to an American, and he's saying certain words, certain terms, or to an Englishman saying certain words, and they're actually in a different community, and they mean different things in those different communities.
So we think because they're using the same word, they mean the same thing, and we all belong to the same club. And if we just take what they're then saying under that label, at face value, we could end up being drifting off in odd directions.
Right.
Okay.
Now, evangelical is an interesting phrase in this regard. You see, one of the characteristics of evangelicalism has always been assurance of salvation.
Yes.
All kinds of New Perspective people want to say they're evangelicals, but the one thing New Perspective does is it assures you that you can't have assurance of salvation.
Right.
And yet, when I think a man called King wrote the history of evangelicals, he said there's lots of different views they have, but the one thing they all have in common is assurance of salvation.
Well, that's interesting because a lot of charismatic Pentecostal third wave people will want to say they're evangelicals, but they will be very unsure about assurance.
And their attitude to the Bible is different. That is,
Yes.
I went to a conference once in Amsterdam where every speaker climbed up on the platform of the lectern with a big black Bible.
Right.
They all put it there. Some of them thumped it, some of them waved it, but only 2 in 10 days actually opened it and read any part of it to us. This was a great conference of evangelicals about evangelism.
Right. So it just shows how vague and unreliable as a good guide the word evangelical is.
It has to do, or it did have to do, it's an 18th century word. 18th century is where it got its title deeds from.
That's when it became popular. It was actually coined by Tyndale. He uses the word in his translation.
Yes.
But it didn't become popular until the Evangelical Awakening.
That's right. And so Wesley, Whitfield, all those crowds used it. And the authority of the Bible was just a basic assumption of what they were doing. And their teaching came out of the Word of God.
Right.
Now, I'm reading an evangelical book the other day where every time a crucial issue came up, he argued from everything except the Bible.
Yes.
So it's not evangelical. It can be evangelical in name, it can be an evangelical publishing house, it can be an evangelical in his roots and traditions, it can be an evangelical theological seminary he went to, but he doesn't argue as an evangelical.
So we need to look beyond the label.
Yes.
We need to look beyond the name and say what is actually going on here. So we need to be a bit more critical, a bit more aware.
Yes, and we need to know our history.
Right.
History is an important element to catch the reality of what the title deeds were about. So even if I vary it, I'm doing it consciously.
It's interesting, Sir Marcus Loane died.
Yeah, a wonderful man.
And he taught a lot of Christian history, didn't he?
He did.
And there's a risk that we could lose that unless we pay attention. We read those books and pay attention to those things, isn't there?
Absolutely. I'm glad that some of the more college men are now producing some histories. Peter Bolt's done one on Thomas More, and there are others coming. But Sir Marcus Loane did a wonderful job for us because he wrote up the Reformation and the masters of the English Reformation and the like. He wrote up the Evangelical Awakening. He talked about the evangelical succession at Oxford and the evangelical succession at in Cambridge. And then he also wrote up the early evangelical ministries here in Sydney.
Yes.
Hewen from the Rock, and so
yes.
Mark these men. And so he kept on defining for us what the terms were about by the history of the people around whom they were first associated. Of course, one of the good marks of when a word is really working for you is when people don't like it.
Ah, yes.
So
yes.
evangelical was a swear word. I mean, Christian was a swear word in the first place, the Antioch.
Coined as a way to put down followers
Yes.
of Christ.
Simeonite. To be called a Sim was a very negative thing in most circles.
So
After
Charles Simeon, and if you don't know, this is a good reason to do some history, isn't it?
Absolutely. If you don't know
Yes.
Charles Simeon, you know nothing. You've got to go get a book on Charles Simeon. Yeah. And it was a put-down word.
Yes.
Well, as long as it's a put-down word, then people who use it of themselves are really the true blue. They are the real McCoy. They are the genuine article.
Happened to Methodists. Started off as a put-down word.
Yes.
And it came to be a word where people said, right, this is where I stand. I'm happy to be called a Methodist.
Yes. It would also have come true with the word enthusiasts, which was also a religious word.
Yes.
You're the word witch. You'll know it better than I will. But
it was the same period. It was in the 18th
Yeah.
century, and it was a way of dismissing
Yes.
people as they're not serious, they're just enthusiasts. They were the evangelicals.
they were the ones who had been overwhelmed by the Spirit, and so it was the more charismatic end of the evangelical experience. But these put-down words, when people are willing to use them of themselves, that's really important. But the evangelical might be one word. Anglican. Anglican is a poor, sad old word today.
Yes.
Because everyone's an Anglican and no one's an Anglican. I mean, recently we've had a bishop here who doesn't actually believe in God. And he's an Anglican bishop.
Yes.
And you think, well...
Well, he calls himself a Christian agnostic.
Yes.
Now, that looks like a contradiction in terms, but he's invented that label and he thinks it means something.
And, well, it does to him, and if a person wants to say that of himself, but it just means that if someone says, I'm an Anglican bishop, that tells you absolutely nothing as to what he is.
In fact, some Anglican bishops will get him saying the really good thing about being Anglican is it doesn't mean anything.
Yes.
It's diverse.
Yes, I
It's
think
because
that was his view.
Yes, it's the big tent. We take in
Yes.
everyone. You know.
And so there's discussions in America at the moment about consecrating an Anglican Buddhist or a Buddhist Anglican. I can't remember which it is. And you think this is mad, but I read last week on holidays, I read a very interesting book by a lesbian Muslim.
Right. Not a Lebanese Muslim.
No, from Uganda, moved to Canada. A fascinating book in which she is arguing, well, I won't tell you what the argument's about, you can read it yourself, it's an interesting book, but the idea that you could call yourself a lesbian Muslim and be expected to be taken seriously as a Muslim is strange.
Like Buddhist Anglican. The word is, when apparently contradictory adjectives and nouns are put together, it's called an oxymoron.
It is.
Not an idiot from Oxford, but an oxymoron.
Yeah.
So it's expressions like, hasten slowly, army intelligence.
Yes.
Expressions like that. And they sound like contradictions, but people think these labels mean something.
Well, they can't they? It does open your mind to options and possibilities. And this woman wants to open your minds. Well, she writes for the Muslim community. She wants them to open their minds to see what genuine Islam is. Because she thinks that Islam has been hijacked by the Wahhabi movement and Saudi Arabia and the rest, and that genuine Islam would allow for a person to make a choice of will over the meaning of the Quran. And
Right.
her choice of will is that it's all right to be what God has created, what Allah has created her to be, namely a lesbian.
I'm sitting here being quite gobsmacked.
Yeah, well, it
about,
was...
about how bizarre she wants to be.
Yes,
Rarely has my gob been so smacked. But so let's leave that and let's get back to our patch. Because let me take the word Protestant.
Yeah.
What has it got a meaning? Has it got a firm, clear meaning? Has it got a historical meaning? Is it an important word?
Yes, it's a later part of the Reformation when they decided clearly that what they were doing was protesting against Roman Catholicism.
Right.
And so a Protestant Roman Catholic is a contradiction in terms.
Right.
Even a Protestant Orthodox is not quite so contradictory, but a bit bizarre because it comes out of the Reformation, which bypassed orthodoxy by and large.
But did it ever stand for anything? Because a friend of mine from Northern Ireland told me once, he said, in Northern Ireland, Kel, there's no Protestants, only anti-Catholics. And no Catholics, only anti-Protestants. It wasn't what you stood for, it was what you stood against.
Yes. Well, Protestant is a bit that way, but the very word sounds like I'm protesting.
It does, doesn't it? Yes, yes.
Yes. And so all those who are not Roman Catholics from the Western Christianity are Protestants. So Anglicanism is Protestant.
So how should we label ourselves? People are going to want to put labels on us, and they didn't want to say you're fundamentalists and put us down or whatever. How do we label ourselves?
Well, firstly is to avoid the nonsense of saying, well, I don't use any labels, I'm just me. Try and find out who I am, which is lovely and cute and nonsense. Labels are necessary and important part of communication.
Right.
Second thing is to know whether you are communicating for the hearer or you are communicating for historically. So,
right.
As
So
I
am I
talk
talking to you in today's English, or am I using a word as it was framed in 1600?
Yes. And am I talking to you in your way of saying it, which may be different to somebody else's around about me?
Right.
Or, and now, if you're in a small linguistic community, well, we all agree with what these words mean. And then I need to work out, well, is it a positive thing or a negative thing in your little world of linguistic
Because I want you to understand me.
Yes.
Yes.
And so if you have an emotional reaction to me,
yes.
See, my friend, a fundamentalist, I say, what do you actually believe? He tells me what he believes. And I say, well, I believe what you believe. I'm a fundamentalist too. But if I talk to the average Australian and I say I'm a fundamentalist, he won't listen to another word I'm saying because I've got a closed mind, which he hasn't.
Yes, his mind is closed to talking to you. But he doesn't have a closed mind.
No, never.
If I tried to call myself a Puritan, for example, I admire the Puritans and I'm a follower of the Puritans, there are people who would think of H.L. Mencken's definition that a Puritan is someone who's frightened that someone somewhere is enjoying themselves.
Yes.
Now, that's so wrong-headed about Puritans.
Yes.
But it means I can't use the word, doesn't it?
That's right. And also, Puritanism stretched over a 100-year period, and the early Puritans and the later Puritans actually believed quite different things. They moved considerably, to say nothing of the fact there was a diversity at any point amongst the Puritans as to what they believed. Now, in certain Reformed Christian circles, being a Puritan is a real big tick. But in most average Australian circles, being a Puritan is a big negative. Now, I read an interesting book by Geoffrey Robertson called about the death of the
regicide.
The regicide. Very interesting book. Yep. He obviously doesn't like Puritans and Puritanism, but when he actually looked at what the Puritans did to King Charles, he worked out they were actually very good. They were clever. They were thoughtful. They indeed created so much of what we take for granted as the basis of jurisprudence and law now.
Right.
But he doesn't like the word because it has those Mencken kinds of
implications
and implications to it. So you've got to, when you're using labels, you must understand who it is that you're talking to, and or take time to explain them.
Right.
And or say, well, I'm using the term in the way historically it was set.
Yeah. So we can say, look, we're children of the Reformation. That's where we come from. We're evangelicals. We believe and teach the Bible. But if we say that amongst ourselves, we have to be careful about the way we identify ourselves to outsiders so we don't unintentionally mislead them.
Yes, that's right. It can be unintentional misleading in that. It also can be unintentional alienating of them.
Yes, and we don't want a barrier, we want to talk to them. Okay.
And so I'm a great follower and believer in Sir Marcus Loane, and that doesn't mean that everything Sir Marcus Loane stood for, he would be happy with me, but what he did was he kept defining himself in terms of the Reformation, in terms of the Evangelical Awakening, in terms of evangelical ministry here in the Anglican Church in Sydney over the history of it. And in his books is the real definition of what he means by those terms, to which by and large I say yes, 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 yes.
So when I'm having a conversation in the office and someone says, now you're religious, Cal, and I say, no, I'm not religious, I'm a Christian.
Yes.
What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to...
Stop that labelling which
Yes.
just has just marginalised you.
Yeah, and provoke a question.
Yes.
Get a bit of space to say something. So
Yes.
that's an appropriate thing
Yeah,
to do.
that's a good thing to do, isn't it?
We also need to be careful about names, about labels, when it comes to what we expose ourselves to. There's a conference or a speaker or a book, and they're wearing a label and we think, well, that's okay, people wearing that label. We need to somehow ask a few more questions, don't we?
Yes, because quite often the label they're using is our label because they want to move us beyond it.
Yes,
To
they want
another
to change
thing.
us.
They want to change us, and so they use our labels. And they have some legitimacy of using our labels because the label is so broad, they fit into some sections of it.
Yeah. Or history has moved on so much, they wouldn't have been in our label then, but they might be now.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
One man I know was trying to move me along politically and socially and theologically. You know, he gave a long list of all the evangelical organisations he was in as a youth, so as to show his credentials in evangelical.
Yes.
But actually, where he was now as an adult was anywhere but evangelical.
Right. So we need to be careful about how we use labels about ourselves with others, and we need to be careful of the labels other people stick on themselves. And we need to be prepared to ask questions, be a bit critical, and not just take on board what anyone says because they're wearing
a label. And also we've got to be careful about how we label other people.
So we don't write them off.
So we don't write them off, so we understand them properly and don't have them kind of pigeonholed, well, he's a this, so therefore he will believe
Yes.
before we've actually heard. But we do need labels to help find our way through life, but labels are a dangerous mechanism of social control.
Right. So don't just grab for the label and say that's dealt with it, I don't need to turn the brain on. Turning the brain on is always a good idea. And this man's quite good at getting us to do that. Come and visit us here at St Andrew's Cathedral. If you're in Sydney or visiting Sydney, love to see you. And Philip, for stretching our brains once more, many thanks.
It's a pleasure.
And pop along and stretch your brain next time here on The Chat Room.